despite a few feeble attempts to stop it before it began. Most of the major players in the Greens and the Blacks realized that a civil war between them was an inevitability years before they actually began to battle. Otto Hightower was undoubtedly the driving force behind much of what the Greens did during the Dance of the Dragons, and he was undeniably one of the best political minds of his time. He may have been one of the savviest strategists and tacticians in Westerosi history, but that doesn't mean that he never made any questionable decisions that could have had a negative effect on the prospects of the Greens. And one choice that the Hightower Targaryen faction made that wasn't the worst, but may not have been the best either, was the decision to marry Aegon and Helaena. There are certainly reasons why wedding Aegon to his sister made sense strategically, but given that the Dance of the Dragons was such a looming threat, marrying outside of the family could have been very beneficial to their odds. So it's interesting that this never seems to have even been an option. Fire and Blood doesn't offer a great deal of insight into this choice either. The marriage between Aegon and Helaena is explained simply, saying, following the ancient tradition of House Targaryen, King Viserys wed his son Aegon the Elder to his daughter Helaena. Now, this certainly makes it sound as if Aegon and Helena's marriage was a foregone conclusion, and maybe in many ways it was. But given how easily influenced King Viserys really is, the apparent fact that there were no other options for Aegon and Helaena even on the table is somewhat interesting. House of the Dragon elaborates on the betrothal of the children slightly more, but still doesn't offer a great deal of insight into Aegon and Helena's match specifically. Rhaenyra suggests that Helaena marry Jace, which Viserys seems keen on but that Alicent forbids. This is an intriguing event for a few reasons, both because it implies that Helaena is not yet betrothed to Aegon, and that Aegon is therefore not betrothed to anyone. It's entirely possible that House of the Dragon's version of events is just a creative flourish on the part of the writers. But given George R. R. Martin's general support for the canon status of the TV series, and given that this is really the only shred of information we even get about Aegon and Helena's marriage, let's assume that at the very least, there were never any other serious possibilities aside from Aegon and Helaena marrying each other. And although it's hard to lay this decision at the feet of Otto Hightower, considering that he wasn't even in King's Landing or acting as hand in this era, it's also hard to believe that he wouldn't have been capable of convincing Viserys, or convincing Alicent to convince Viserys, to make another choice if he had very seriously wanted something else to happen. And while marrying Aegon and Helaena wasn't the worst choice, it wasn't necessarily the best one either. So it's interesting to consider why this was ultimately what happened. It's certainly not a foregone conclusion that betrothing them to other people would have impacted the dance in any conclusive way, but it clearly leads to the question of why this would have seemed like a better option at the time, and why the Hightower faction would have chosen it. Although the idea of it is obviously unappealing, Otto's suggestion that Aegon and Rhaenyra marry may have been one of his best proposals throughout his time as Hand. There were a few possible ways of actually avoiding the dance, and frankly, had Rhaenyra still had children with Harwin Strong and tried to pass them off as legitimate, war still would have been a guarantee. But uniting Aegon's claim and Rhaenyra's would have had the dual benefit of joining the Greens and the Blacks while also guaranteeing that Daemon wouldn't have had a shot at the throne. However, Aegon's betrothal to Helaena is curious, because it offers absolutely none of these benefits. Helena's claim to the throne is essentially negligible, and all her match with Aegon really does is consolidate the Greens' power even more. And while that's not necessarily a terrible choice, it's a distinctly un-Hightower one. Because what further makes the marriage between Aegon and Helaena more interesting is that it just doesn't generally suit the strategy that House Hightower has typically employed to gain power. They're an interesting family within the dance for this specific purpose, because the Targaryens have largely gained and kept their power because they share it with as few people as possible, while the Hightowers have consistently gained and kept power by creating connections with other powerful people. Again, this is presuming that the Hightowers even had a decisive hand in who married who. But again, based on Alicent's strong denial to Rhaenyra's proposal in House of the Dragon, it seems like she, and therefore her father, would have had some influence over the betrothals of her children. But on the flip side of that, even if Alicent had a level of influence, it clearly wouldn't have been solely up to her to decide who the king's children married. So perhaps the marriage between Aegon and Helaena is understandable from that point of view. Marrying off Jace to Helaena may have been an appealing prospect to Viserys, so following Targaryen tradition even more intensely by marrying brother to sister could have been the only easier sell to the king. And there could have been an even deeper angle to this, as many of Viserys' advisors spent years encouraging him to make Aegon his heir in place of Rhaenyra. And despite his agreement with Corlys, it seems like he might be more inclined to put 2 of his children on the Iron Throne instead of 1. Plus, although Viserys wasn't particularly politically savvy, if Alicent tried to marry Aegon and Helaena outside of the family, or if she simply refused to betroth her children at all while Viserys was still alive, it would undoubtedly arouse some suspicion. Or, there is an interesting possibility that would make some sense if Otto and House Hightower were really trying to play the long game. Because, although the Greens wound up with some of the most powerful dragons in Targaryen history, Alicent's children literally had a 50% success rate when it came to actually hatching dragons. Once again, Fire and Blood is pretty vague when it comes to the precise age at which Helaena claimed Dreamfire. All we really know is that she became a dragon rider at or before the age of 11. Similarly, even if Aemond claimed the most powerful dragon alive, he didn't actually become a dragon rider until he was 10 years old. In contrast, Rhaenyra's children had a 100% success rate when it came to hatching their dragons, at the point where Aegon and Helena's betrothal would have likely been decided upon. So, regardless of what kind of argument the Hightower faction could make against the legitimacy of the Strong Boys, ultimately, dragons was where the power of Targaryens rested. It was what allowed them to conquer Westeros and create the Iron Throne in the first place. But no Targaryen is guaranteed a dragon, and Targaryens without dragons had historically been generally far less powerful. So it's not beyond belief that, given Alicent's apparent dragon rider failure rate in comparison to Rhaenyra, the Hightowers decided to marry Aegon to Helaena in the hopes that it would up the chances of Aegon's children also being dragon riders. And although that would have been a calculated risk, at the very least, playing the long game like this is a strategy that House Hightower has employed with great success for millennia. Plus, Alicent did have children who could serve as marriage ambassadors when things did get sticky. Sure, it might have been better for her to have 4 betrothal options to offer up rather than 2. But even with Aegon and Helaena off the table, she had 2 dragon rider children who were available by the time the Greens and the Blacks went to war. So in that sense, it's also understandable that the Greens would hedge their bets and neither go all in on consolidating their power, nor spreading it around to create more alliances. Because, while developing connections and accumulating power through marriages can be beneficial, it's really only as valuable as each family in the Union wants it to be. As we've seen many times over in Fire and Blood and A Song of Ice and Fire, a betrothal pact or even an all-out marriage can still be contentious or straight-up betrayed if the arranged deal winds up going south. Furthermore, although the Hightowers have not generally been shy about letting others take the lead when it comes to power, after all, despite the fact that they've arguably been the most powerful family in the Reach for centuries, they've always let another family like the Gardeners or the Tyrells be the front-facing figureheads of Reacher power. Dragon power is a bit of a different ballgame. Because yes, being able to build alliances during the Dance of the Dragons would be incredibly helpful, but eventually, the Civil War was going to be over. By the time the dance begins, obviously all of Alicent's children are dragon riders. So spreading out that kind of power and giving 4 other families potential access to dragons or a dragon bloodline themselves could be dangerous for them in the long term. And again, if there's anything that the Hightowers understand, it's the long term. So, the betrothal between Aegon and Helaena is an interesting facet of the Dance of the Dragons, because it's neither a good decision or a bad one. It's not conclusively obvious that the prospects of the Greens would have been much better had they married outside of the family. However, The potential benefits of having Helaena and Aegon free to marry others also seems pretty obvious. And while again, there is no guarantee it would have helped them, we can see in the future of Westeros that creating marriage alliances is literally enough to topple the Targaryen dynasty. Robert's rebellion was undoubtedly more successful because Robert, Ned, and Jon Arryn had genuine, loving connections with each other. They were more than allies. But the fact that Ned, Robert, and Jon were all free to marry really conclusively ended the rebellion in their favor. The assistance of House Tully was vital and wouldn't have happened without Cat and Lysa's betrothal. And the fact that Robert was free to marry Cersei and give Tywin a Lannister queen was a clincher. Clearly, we're not dealing with identical situations, but as we can see with Aemond and Luke's meeting with House Baratheon, being able to offer a marriage can make all the difference when it comes to winning necessary allies. The only potential downside of a decision like this, though, is that frankly, there weren't many houses that could offer the kind of power that was necessary to mount a full-scale civil war at the time. The Lannisters were already on the side of the Greens. The Valyrians at least had the appearance of being on the side of the Blacks. And in this era, there just weren't a lot of single houses that could have swung power drastically in favor of House Hightower. Having the hand of a dragon rider and the literal king would have undeniably been a tempting offer. But the reality is, there just weren't families who could offer the kind of power that would be worth such a sacrifice. Ultimately, we'll never know what would have happened if Helaena had not married Aegon, but it's an interesting prospect to consider. And it's an even more interesting decision to try to work through. Otto and the entirety of House Hightower saw the Dance of the Dragons coming from a mile away, so every choice that they made in the lead up to it had meaning. That makes Aegon and Helena's marriage all the more relevant, and it's intriguing to consider why this match was made, and how the course of the war could have been changed if it wasn't made. But what do you think? Was marrying Aegon and Helaena the smartest decision at the time? Leave your comments and opinions below, and if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.